It's been great to be here this week. Chad and I have been burning it at both ends a little bit, sort of meeting with a lot of different congregations and people of faith and talking about what faith communities can do about the environment. And if you haven't noticed, at least in this country, right at this particular moment, the environment faces some fairly significant challenges. I don't think it's a surprise to anybody to say that the current federal administration has a very clearly expressed and profound antipathy towards the protection of the environment, towards addressing climate change. This comes on the heels of at least the sort of final 2 to 3 years of the previous administration, where there had been some very substantial progress made. And so it represents a real sort of challenge and a real setback for those people that follow the science on this stuff. There's a recognition that there is really no time to lose. And in my line of work, I deal with more than my share of folks who are climate change skeptics. And what I would say is that it's pretty rare that I meet a climate change skeptic under the age of 25. I think that what we're dealing with in part is a generational transition that can't happen fast enough in terms of the framing and understanding of what this is about, but we know that we've got to move things along faster. And what I wanted to do tonight was to share a few stories that I think give some examples of what faith-based groups have done over the course of the past 6-7 years to address these issues, and to hope that stirs the pot a little bit, and then to have some time for some conversation with you all after that. And I want to start the story back in 2009, which was when you guys were probably, 3 years old. I'm not sure. You get to my age. You get to be my age in my mid-50s, and you guys start looking really enviably young, just believe me. Back in 2009, there was a big climate summit in Copenhagen. And the hopes of the world really were pinned on achieving an international binding climate agreement at that point in time. The science had been clear for several decades that kind of agreement was really vitally important in terms of restricting emissions and bending what people call the emissions curve so that it would peak and then start to go down and make it possible to restrain temperature rise to a manageable level. There was great hope going into that conference that an agreement would happen. A number of world leaders, including President Obama, really threw themselves into the negotiations process as energetically as they possibly could. But sadly, at the end of those negotiations, there was no ability to reach an agreement. And so this conference disbanded without any agreement and with a tremendous sense of disappointment and of concern and of despair on the part of people who'd followed this issue, because they honestly felt like there had been a lead up of 3 or 4 years trying to build momentum towards this conference. It takes a long time to get governments from a lot of different countries around the world pulling in the same direction and willing to commit time and resources and attention politically to prioritizing an issue like that. And there had been that kind of investment of time and effort, and there was very little, if anything, to show for it. And it was a tremendous sort of cause for concern, because even back then the data was very clear that severe storm activity was rising, that sea levels were rising, and we knew that the more carbon that goes up in the atmosphere and it sits there for several hundred years before it dissipates, the long-term effects were grave, and there literally wasn't any time to lose. So Copenhagen comes and goes. The year after Copenhagen, the Republican Party, led by the Tea Party, took over the House of Representatives. And what that meant was that there was clearly no prospect of climate change legislation in the United States for the foreseeable future. And to be frank, what happened within the climate change community was that essentially people went into a period of depression because they didn't know what the heck they were going to do about it. There were no realistic political prospects. There were there were some states where there could be some progress made, but everybody knew that without federal leadership, it was really difficult to get things where they needed to be. And so there was this weird period of silence when nobody really knew what kind of step to take, because they'd had this sort of vision that you would educate people, and people would then, with their education about the issue, speak with their elected officials, and the elected officials would be enlightened by the combination of scientific knowledge and sort of pressure from an informed citizenry, and they would proceed to pass laws, and those laws would take effect nationally, and there would be enough nations doing that it would create pressure for an international agreement. And it was this very nice rational theory of change, and it just cratered, and there was nothing that people had as a story to explain to themselves, you know, what's going to happen, how's this problem going to get solved. So in the midst of this sort of sense of disorientation and concern and despair and anger and everything about this, a couple of colleges actually ended up being interesting places where some new energy started to cut loose. One college just outside of Philadelphia, some students there who were in the environmental club or whatever it was called at the college, they got this idea, and they got it from reading history about what some college campuses had done during the apartheid era in South Africa, when there had been a very active divestment movement in relationship to pressuring the government of the apartheid government in South Africa. They got this idea that they thought that they ought to press their university to divest its endowment from any holdings in the fossil fuel industry. Nobody was talking about this at this point in time. Totally, you know, it seemed totally out of left field. They got themselves educated, and they worked with some environmental groups, and they got their facts together, and they went to they got a meeting with the university president, who was appropriately accessible to them and stuff like that. They laid out the case, they made their ask, and the university president, with a really sort of very sort of endearing level of sort of paternal care, you know, thanked them very much for their concern, and essentially told them to go back and do their homework and, you know, let him run the show. So they did that. They were ticked off, and, you know, that kind of stuff happens. Word got out about what they'd done, and the same thing happened on a couple of other university campuses. Later that summer, in 2011, Bill McKibben, the environmentalist, wrote an article in Rolling Stone magazine that went viral called "The Terrifying New Math of Global Warming." And in that article, one of the bright points that he highlighted was what these students had done at these couple of universities. The article went viral. I mean, it was one of the most read articles from Rolling Stone ever, and it got massive uptake. And within 6 months, there were fossil fuel divestment movements that were active on over 400 college campuses around the country and around the world. Because clearly he'd struck a chord, and people were like, you know what, these international talks may be dead in the water, but we're going to start doing what we can, and we're going to start sending a message about what we think is the right way to go. Faith groups got involved really quickly in this movement. And it was interesting because it wasn't only the usual liberal suspect churches that got involved. The first church that divested from fossil fuels was that well-known hotbed of radicalism, the Church of Sweden, which in a sort of very systematic Scandinavian way said, you know, for many years now we have believed that human activity is behind climate change. We believe it comes from the burning of fossil fuels. The industry's had a long time, and they've known this also. We've asked them to change. They haven't, and so it's no longer right for us to profit from an industry that's behaving in this kind of way, and they sold their stocks. They were followed by some of the more usual liberal suspects in the Protestant community in the US and elsewhere, the United Church of Christ, the Unitarian Universalist Association, numerous presbyteries in the Presbyterian Church USA, the Episcopal Church in the US, of which I'm a member. We were able to organize a divestment campaign there. And what was interesting was we saw the presiding bishop, the head of the Episcopal Church nationally at that point, who was an oceanographer by her first training and was an avowed sort of environmentalist. She publicly opposed the divestment efforts that we were undertaking, because she said essentially, you know, we need don't mix up, you know, money management with politics and morality. I think that's not a position I would take if I was a bishop, or I hope I wouldn't, but nonetheless. But, you know, it was interesting because she took that position 10 days before the vote at the General Convention of the church, and the resolution to divest passed by an overwhelming margin. And that was one of those moments where we realized, okay, there's something that's bigger than us that's going on here, because this idea is starting to grow legs on its own. A bunch of churches in Australia voted to divest. And there, about a third of the economy is based on extractive industries, mining and fossil fuels. And I can tell you that it takes, a bit of courage if you're a church leader in a culture like that, when you can be guaranteed that a reasonable percentage of your donations come from people who've been well compensated by those industries or who are financially dependent in some way on those industries, to stand up and say, look, I'm sorry, but we can't anymore sort of say that this is okay. That takes some courage. Same thing, the United Church of Canada, the biggest Protestant denomination in Canada, where a similar percentage, about 30% of the economy is extractives oriented. So what you saw was these institutions taking this kind of stand, and one of the things that I thought was really the coolest was last year, when the international climate negotiations were in, or 2 years ago when they were in Morocco. No, that was last year, sorry. And there had never been a public divestment commitment by an Islamic faith-based institution. And one of the clear reasons for that is that a substantial amount of the religious and charitable work within the Islamic world is funded by money from oil and gas revenues, because that's the biggest source of wealth within Muslim-majority countries. And so obviously and understandably, groups don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. The Islamic Society of North America, on the occasion of those climate negotiations in Morocco, a Muslim-majority country, made a decision that they were going to divest their holdings from fossil fuels and encourage other Muslim institutions to do the same. Again, it was a remarkable sort of courageous step, and it was a step that they didn't need to take. So it really was interesting to sort of see how this thing started to grow legs. It wasn't just sort of the divestment movement there where things started to happen. In 2014, Ban Ki-moon, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations at that point in time, called for a climate change summit in New York, ostensibly to gather world leaders together. But through back-channel communications, he made it very clear that he thought that there was precious little hope that world leaders would do anything if there weren't thousands and thousands and thousands of people in the streets peacefully calling for change. So imagine the Secretary General of the UN, who we all think of as being a person of considerable power, literally getting on the phone with leaders of larger nonprofit and civil society organizations pleading for help with this. And so we, along with a number of partners from labor unions and environmental groups and social justice groups and racial justice groups and student groups, worked together to plan the First People's Climate March in New York City. And it was a lot of fun planning the religious sort of, organizing the religious sector. We had about 35 different religious traditions and denominations sort of represented, everything from we said everything from Anglican to Zoroastrian, literally, and sort of it was a tremendous mix. One of the funnier moments that came was we had sort of different tables working for each of these different faith communities. About 3 weeks before the march, I got a call from representatives of one of the larger atheist groups in the country. And they were irritated because we didn't have an atheist table. And I was like, who would have known, So we made an atheist table, and they started to organize, they planned to march as part of the faith sector as well. We built a school bus-sized replica of Noah's Ark to pull, which we pulled through the entire length of the march with a biodiesel-powered pickup truck. And on the side of the Ark, we had a banner that said, "We are all Noah now," because there was Noah, protecting life, and that's what we've all got to be about at this point in time. So the night before the march, group of people who'd been key in doing the organizing work got together, and we're just sort of, hoping and praying that we'd get 100,000 people in the streets. And so the next day, when 400,000 people showed up and marched peacefully, and the story was on the front page of just about every major newspaper around the world, again, there was this sense that there's something that is much bigger than any of us individually that's going on. And I've got to say, it was just a remarkable experience to be there, because all of a sudden, understanding fully all of the political roadblocks and ridiculousness that was around the delay in action on this that had happened, there was this sense of power in a very positive sense that, if we work together, we can change things, and we need to do that. So, 2014 gave way to 2015. The big Paris climate negotiations were at the end of 15, and so there was a need to really keep on bringing everybody's A game to make as much good stuff happen as possible. In the middle of the year, Pope Francis issued his encyclical Laudato Si, which is a phrase from the Canticle of the Sun by St. Francis of Assisi. And I hope that you all get a chance to read that document at some point in time, or at least read a couple of chapters from it. I think it's the most remarkable religious document that's been written in the course of the past quarter century, half century. It's a truly remarkable piece of writing that captures a beautiful appreciation for the gift that the earth represents and the way that it supports our life, and the sadness and the unacceptability morally of the way in which we're treating it. The language is just great. I mean, the Pope is obviously a pretty compelling and likable guy to start with, but he really is just, it's an amazing document, and it's really, really worth reading. So we organized a march into St. Peter's Square 10 days after the issuance of the encyclical, a multi-faith march, because we wanted to show the Pope and the world that people of all faiths had his back, basically, and that we wanted to, we wanted to send the message that this is a Catholic thing, this is a Jewish thing, it's a Muslim thing, it's a Hindu thing, it's a Buddhist thing, it's an environmentalist thing, it's an indigenous thing, it's an everything thing. And so we worked with partners in Rome. We had this great team of artists, because one of the things that you do when you're an activist and you don't know how big a crowd you're going to generate, you want to look big for the media, and so you do a lot of artwork, because the artwork makes you, so we big art deal. We ended up doing pretty well. We had about 5,000 people who came as part of it, which was a decent turnout. So we had, in New York, there had been these beautiful bird kites, these sort of birds about, with a wingspan of about 6 feet. You stick them up on top of a 30-foot bamboo pole, and you sort of wave them back and forth, and they go soaring through the air, and there were 6 of them at the climate march in New York. We had 30 of them made. The guy who makes them works for the Muppets, and we were able to get him on sequestered from the Muppets for a week to come over to Rome and build these birds, and it was just spectacular. So we had talked to the Vatican security to let them know that we were coming, and we've been told, because we had banners and signs and these birds, we've been told that we couldn't come into St. Peter's Square with that stuff. And I understand, because I've done demonstrations. This worries about hurting people with if you've got poles and pipes and that kind of thing. And I understood. So we had a plan. We were going to fan out around St. Peter's Square with our birds and sort of do a thing that way. So we got about 150 yards from St. Peter's Square, and the Swiss Guard guy in his wonderful costume comes sort of waddling out to meet us and tells us in broken English that we can come in, because word had come down kind of literally from on high that it was okay for us to. And we, like I said, we had back channels into the Pope's office, and he knew we were coming, and he's not stupid in terms of what makes for good media stuff, and he liked the idea of this. So into St. Peter's Square we marched. If you ever go on a march, any kind of long distance march with faith groups, march with the Hare Krishnas, because they dance the whole way. And so it was like really hot, but everybody who was with the Hare Krishnas was smiling the whole way, because they were just dancing and having fun. So we walk into St. Peter's Square, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Baha'i, Sikh, Jain, Pentecostal, Catholic, Protestant, indigenous, everything. The Hare Krishnas are dancing into St. Peter's Square, right? So we get into St. Peter's Square, the Pope comes out on his balcony, says his customary blessing, and then he speaks to the crowd for a couple of minutes, and my Italian is terrible, but you could understand pretty easily that he was saying that he wanted to thank people of different faiths for coming together to show their care for our common home. And he said, God bless you. So at that point, several of the Catholics in the group burst into tears, because they never thought in their lifetime that they would see their leader step up in such a cool way. The Hare Krishnas are dancing the whole time. And this young Jewish guy standing next to me turns to me and says, I'm a Jew from Brooklyn. I just walked into St. Peter's Square with my new friends, the Hare Krishnas, and the Pope said thank you. And it was, again, just sort of one of these moments where, and you're sort of hearing me say this over and over again, when you realize there's something bigger than us that's going on with all of this stuff. And so, the rest is history. World leaders came together in Paris. They did something that world leaders had never previously been able to do, which is that they agreed on an international agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions. Everybody understood that that agreement was a first step, that it wasn't on its own adequate to solve the problem, but it was an important first step, and it represented genuine positive momentum by the human family in relationship to the one place that we have that we call home. And it was a very powerful and positive example of how action at every single level of society around the world made a difference for good. So that happened, and then we come to November of 2016, and there was an election in this country. And all of a sudden, all of that progress seems and is in very real danger. We have now a stated goal of the current administration to withdraw the United States from that agreement, whether that, whatever actually happens in terms of the technicalities of that, the reality is that our federal government is no longer committed to addressing climate change and is instead now actively rolling back the regulations and the steps and measures that were put in place to move progress forward in that way. And I don't need to tell you all that represents a grave and severe threat to the well-being of hundreds and hundreds of millions of people on this planet, not in sort of future generations' lifetime, but now. I don't know about you all, but the last month has been pretty shocking in terms of watching one titanic storm after another batter Texas and Florida and islands across the Caribbean. And when you look at the photographs from Puerto Rico and from the Virgin Islands and from Texas and from Florida, and you see the devastation that's caused, to me, as a pastor, as a person of faith, just as a human being, I honestly don't understand the nature of the political polarization around this issue, because at the end of the day, what climate change does is it causes suffering. It hurts people. The people it hurts worst are the people who've contributed least to the problem. It's people who are poor, people who are the most vulnerable culturally and economically and politically wherever they live around the world. And I think that as just a simple matter of decency, we have to be able to find a way to transform and push forward and get progress made on this. And so, what we're doing, a couple of things that we're doing in response. We're continuing with the divestment work that we've been doing in the past. We are in the belief that these kinds of issues and these kinds of civilizational changes only get solved by very, very widespread, distributed, values-based leadership. We're at the early stage of starting circles, multi-faith circles of environmental leadership in different places around the world, because we believe that this is a struggle that needs to be engaged in every single town and every single community on the face of this planet, and that faith communities are one of the very few institutions that have a presence in just about every community on the face of the earth, and that we need to collectively step forward and stand up for Mother Earth and make a future that's viable. We're working with faith-based investors to try to convince them to start investing some of their money not in the fossil fuel industry, but in scaling up distributed renewable energy systems so that the 1.1 billion people on the face of the planet who don't have access to electricity get that access from renewable energy. Because if they get that access from fossil fuels, we have not a prayer of keeping temperature rise to a reasonable and safe level. We are going to be announcing a sort of international multi-faith campaign later on this year, where we're going to be inviting faith leaders to make individual commitments, because there are three aspects of our own individual behavior that make the biggest impact in terms of our own carbon footprints, which is the need to use renewable energy at home, the need to eat and shift towards a plant-based diet, much less meat, more vegetarianism, and the need to reduce the carbon footprint from our transportation, which means less car travel, a shift towards electric vehicles powered by renewable energy, less plane travel. And that's where the three of the asks in the sermon that I gave this morning came from, because those are the three behaviors that really matter the most. I'm going to close by saying that I think it is an Irish saying. It sounds like an Irish saying. If it's not, it should be. Is this a private fight, or can anybody get involved? And I think that this is, clearly for you guys, this is, it's your time to rise with this stuff. There are a lot of good people in the world who care deeply about these issues. This movement needs to grow. We need your leadership, your call to action. You're calling society to account. You're urging society to do what is right for the sake of your future. We need your leadership on this, so please don't be shy. And please bring your A game with this, because the world needs it. And why don't I stop there, and I'd love sort of questions, comments, agreements, disagreements, whatever you'd like. But thanks again very much for the chance to be here. I've really I enjoyed the chance to speak in chapel today. I thought that the idea of limiting a preacher to 500 words was totally brilliant. I spend a lot of time in religious ceremonies of varying kinds, and I can guarantee you that one gift that most religious leaders do not have is sticking to 500 words. So and kidding aside, I really loved it. I thought it set a really, really cool tone, and it was a real pleasure to be there, as it's been a pleasure to be here tonight. So what do you guys have to say? Tell me what you think, and let's sort of do some back and forth now for a while.
What did you say the three keys were?
In terms of individual behavior, it's using renewable energy at home, moving to a plant-based diet, so less or no meat, and minimizing your transportation footprint, which means high mileage vehicles, minimizing the amount of individual car travel you're doing, and only flying when it's absolutely necessary. Flying is a surprisingly big one, and this is an area where I'm guilty. So you fly from East Coast to West Coast, the individual on the average cross-country flight causes as many greenhouse gas emissions in that 1 5-hour flight as the average citizen of Brazil does in an entire year. So it's really wild when you sort of think about, this is stuff that's invisible to us, but those are the three behaviors. And they're not easy behaviors to change, all of them, frankly. It's, you talk about, shifting to vegetarian-based diets, and you get a lot, yeah, right. I mean, my kids, are all over me about that. This is what we got to deal with, and it's for real. Yeah.
Can you explain the plant-based diet and how that would be more environmentally sound as opposed to?
Yep. So it's a little bit gross, but essentially methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas. It's 20 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. When cows fart and defecate, that releases a large amount, and burp, that releases a large amount of methane. And with the growth in animal agriculture on an international level, the emissions related to animal agriculture, particularly beef cattle and dairy cattle, is accelerating dramatically. And so one of the issues you run into is you get deforestation in the Amazon. An awful lot of that is caused so that there can be increased beef cattle production. So you see habitat being destroyed, which has been sucking carbon out of the air and sticking it in the ground, and instead you're raising cattle there in very concentrated kinds of ways, and it releases a lot of. The other piece is that to create a 1/3 pound hamburger requires about 660 gallons of water, just between the water that's needed to water the grain that the cattle has to eat, and then the water for the cow itself. Water has to get pumped. Pumps use electricity. So if you think through sort of every stage of the system, what you've got is an energy intensive kind of system. And so that's the. What's interesting is I think for a lot of people the most compelling argument around shifting away from eating meat is the horrible cruelty that animals are treated with. I mean, And it's really fascinating. We have a Hindu project that works with Hindu temples across India, and they think that it's really interesting and wrong that Western environmentalism doesn't talk about vegetarianism very much, because from their perspective, the cow is revered deeply in Indian culture, and they view the infliction of suffering and cruelty on animals as being a major, major issue. And so it's been very interesting. So the Hindus are very down with the vegetarian thing. And they sort of, think, why is it taking us so long to get here?
Makes sense.
I have to ask the investment question.
Mm-hmm.
So if you divested
Yep.
from the oil, have you done a comparison as to how much you would be making percentage-wise per year before divestment and then after?
Yep. So there's actually been quite a bit of studying done, and there are a couple of so one short answer is that over the last several years, the oil and gas industry has been a bad investment. So to be frank, even without moral reasons, if your investment manager has your investments in the fossil fuel industry over the last several years, it hasn't done well. There are two different approaches that people take to this. One is you look for industries or industries that essentially have the same risk return profile as the fossil fuel industry, and you take fossil fuel stocks out and you plug those substitute industries in with the same risk return profile, and there have been studies that have shown that there's no meaningful difference whatsoever. There's a slightly statistically significant better performance without the fossil fuel sector, but it's pretty small. So the other approach is if you take the money out and seek to do investment in the clean tech renewable energy sector, and there it's much more dependent on the skill of the investment manager. That has been traditionally a tricky sector. With the initiative that we're looking at in terms of the rate of growth in the renewable energy sector is extremely strong. Mm-hmm. It's a young sector, whereas the fossil fuel industry is a mature industry. So these are industries at different stages of their life cycles. And so one of the things that we're looking at with this initiative is there a way that faith-based investors, who may well be willing with at least a portion of their investments to accept a slightly lower return in return for the social good, if we could find a way to pool investments and provide upfront capital that would help buy down the risk for other investors, that might well unleash a very substantial level of investment. So there are people looking at how to sort of structure this thing, but the answer is, in terms of divestment, what we've seen makes the difference is having a willing investment manager. If you have a willing investment manager, they can figure out how to do it without costing you money. But there are a number of investment managers who aren't comfortable doing that, and then that puts you in the tough situation of having to decide about what to do about that.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
There seem to be some moral trade-offs, even in green energy. So we're hearing pretty terrible stories about mining operations in Africa that are required for both photovoltaic and for battery.
Yep.
So when you think about those, how do you sort of sort through the moral trade-offs involved with the green energy?
Yep. It's a good question. So, and there are serious issues. I mean, there are massive human rights violations in Latin America, which you've obviously heard about in terms of the behavior of the extractive industries, the mining industry there. And it's a real issue. So I think the way that we approach it is and a lot of it, to be completely frank, a lot of the abuses are about labor it's a combination of labor standards, or the treatment of workers, and the treatment of the environment. So our answer would be you get governments to enforce standards in terms of treatment of workers and treatment of the environment, because some of that damage can be mitigated substantially. I think the other piece of the picture is that there is a question of scale. The scale of harm due to climate change is very substantially greater than the scale of harm related to the activity of those particular mining operations. That should never be used to justify it. And at the same point in time, the problem is that it's not a perfect world. And so it's one thing to stand here at William Jewell and say that ought to happen. The reality is that some of it is going to happen. And so I don't want to be sanguine about that. It's not a comfortable situation.
But having misdiagnosed the probability of government action before, what makes you confident that we can get this one right?
In terms of regulating the extractive stuff, I don't. I am not.
Okay.
That's why I think it's a fair question. I don't think
We're
this
choosing
is.
among poisons.
Yeah, and I think it's, from the data that I've seen, the risks related to, the reality at this point is that, as you know, the scientific consensus is sort of 2 degrees Celsius temperature rise above pre-industrial levels is the guardrail beyond which if you go, we get into extraordinarily dangerous territory with climate change. And all of the data now suggests that we're headed substantially beyond that level. And that what happens with that is that you get sea level rises that literally make many of the major cities in the world uninhabitable because they're underwater. And then you get forced migration at a level that causes a level of social strife that is chaotic beyond what we're able to imagine. And so the magnitude of harm, but like I said, we work with indigenous and faith-based groups in Brazil, for example, where the current government is weakening the land tenure agreements that had given indigenous people some control over their land and some ability to keep extractive industries out. And there's been, related to those, lessening government protections, there's been an increase in killings of indigenous and environmental leaders in Brazil, and it's clearly related. So it's you're right to raise the issue because it's not an easily solved problem.
I have found over the years that sometimes when people, well, you mentioned the beginning story, the college student said, let's divest. But when people are given some encouragement and some empowerment when it comes to extracting or whether it comes to doing things in your own congregation or whatever, the people can be pretty creative. And to me, that's one of the ways some of this is going to be solved, is groups are going to get creative. And they're going to say, okay, if you're going to extract, we're going to figure out some better ways to do it. Because we've lived on the land forever. And we can tell you what's, those types of things.
Yep.
So I think the power is really with the people.
Well, I think it's, the number of social activists have said there's 2 ways to change, there's 2 ways to change things. You organize people and you organize money. And both are important. I think one of the things that's most frustrating, that I find most frustrating about this, is that the technologies, the renewable technologies, are ready for scaling. That what's holding us back is no longer meaningful levels of technological innovation. There's a lot of expansion of renewable capacity that can happen. The challenge is that there's a legacy system. Energy is fundamental to society, and just as the provision of water is, just as transportation systems, water systems, energy systems always historically received very substantial subsidies from government. Back in the Roman days, it was the Roman Empire that built the roads, right? It's all the way back. What happens now is that you've got the fossil fuel industry, which is a very powerful industry and which has created a lot of good in the world. This is one of these things again where it's, we all are here benefiting from the fact that there's been abundant energy in our lifetimes. It's foolish to pretend that that's not the case. And on some level, it's foolish or wrong not to be grateful for that. And at the same point in time, you've got this industry now that gets over $1 billion a day in government subsidies of various kinds around the world. So that's, it's over 400 billion total in government subsidies annually. They spend over 600 billion a year, over 350 billion a year looking for new sources of fossil fuel. And that's just it's a force of nature. It's just massive. And so it's at the same time that you've got these upsurging renewables industries ready to go prime time, you've got a system that's crimping that progress. The progress is happening. It's interesting, if you look at the growth curves for renewable energy, their performance, And you look what's found. I saw a lecture a couple of weeks ago where a guy had shown that back in 2000 and 2005 and 2010, here were Greenpeace's projections about the potential for growth of renewable energy. And everybody at the time thought, of course, this is Greenpeace, this is totally over-optimistic. The results have been better than Greenpeace's most ambitious expectations. So good stuff is happening. That's, it's just a question of how do you really unleash that creativity so that it can happen at the necessary speed. And that's the level of frustration that I feel with it. Because I agree with you. I think I live in the New York area where there's lots of people who get fed up with working on Wall Street and they quit to do something else. And I can't tell you, there are lots of smart people who are ready to jump out of their finance jobs for Wall Street and work on finance for renewable energy if the policy signals were consistent and reliable. So that's the frustration.
One more question, which is a theology question.
Mm-hmm.
Did your theology, when you learned theology, was there an environmental aspect to it? It seems that there's been a criticism of American Protestantism, especially, that why is any type of connection to the earth, why is there not an expression of that in Protestant theology? And was there a point in your own pilgrimage where you were able to bring that together, and how did that happen?
I appreciate the question very much. So let me give you a slightly roundabout answer. The short answer is yes. What we've seen, so we've done interviews with a couple of hundred people, different religious, ethnic, racial, cultural backgrounds, socioeconomic backgrounds, asked them where their most powerful spiritual experience took place. And there have been social science studies of this also. Consistently, 2/3 to 3/4 of all people talk about an outdoor spiritual experience being their most powerful spiritual experience. And I tell you, it is really, when we've done interviews with people about this stuff, it is really cool to watch people talk about these experiences that they've had outdoors. Because these are experiences of awe and of beauty and it's really, it's very, very powerful stuff to watch, and it's very healing to watch people talk about these experiences. In seminary, I went to seminary in the late 80s, early 90s, there was not much on the radar screen about this at all. And I think that disconnect between, on the one hand, people have these experiences, and on the other hand, organized religion in this country does not talk about, validate, refer to, affirm those experiences is a very real gap that you sort of, really put your finger on. I think that, and I think and hope that the answer to that is that clergy, pastors, faith leaders will realize that it's in their self-interest to be able to start to engage that aspect of people's spiritual lives because it's healing and it's rejuvenating and it's good. And it will be an asset for a congregation that's able to engage at that kind of level. But there's this, there's this bad habit that Protestantism has had, and it's not just in this country, it's elsewhere also, where you get too close to the earth and it's suspect, you're pagan, and it's a weird kind of, it's a weird kind of thing, but that suspicion is out there. It's very interesting. I mean, it's different in, so we find when we work with Latino congregations, for example, a very significant percentage of the Latino community in this country still works in agriculturally oriented professions and still has substantial ties to family in Latin America, where there's a very good chance that there are people working on the land. And I think as a result of that, the demographic in this country that is most supportive of action on climate change is the Latino community. I mean, the numbers are off the charts, and no one's really explained it. I think that's an explanation for it. You look in African American communities, there's a very painful and complicated dynamic because of the history of slavery. And it's, if your descendants, your people have been forced to work the land, then you've got a somewhat ambivalent relationship, understandably often. I mean, you know, I've had African, when I get to preach every once in a while in black churches, invariably, people will come up to me afterwards and say, you know, I'm with you, but you need to understand that, you know, it was not safe when my grandparents were growing up to go for a walk out in the woods, because that's where people got lynched. So there's this, you know, that history matters with this stuff a lot in terms of our relationship to the earth. And I think that the environmental movement in this country has some real growing to do in terms of being able to understand the history of people's relationships, both individually and culturally, with the land and what that means. I think for a lot of people, environmentalism is a middle and upper middle class white thing. You know, it's about where do you get to go on vacation, and you know, and it's about it's a privilege in a sense to be able to be an environmentalist. We do a growing amount of work with labor unions, where it's about how do you create an economy that creates good jobs, green jobs with good wages, so that people can go through, you know, the skilled trade. I mean, if you figure that almost every building in this country needs to be retrofitted, that's an enormous amount of work, and that, you know, that's an opportunity to help rebuild a vibrant middle class in this country. And that ought to be talked about as part of environmental issues, and too often it's not. So, but coming back to your original question, I think that gap between people's personal experience of God outdoors, which I know is alive and well, and what their organized faith community does or says about that, the gap's too big and needs to get reconnected.